This is the climatographer's Dr. Mark Trexler with the Climate Countdown for the Costa Report. Today's topic: how good is the scientific community at communicating climate risks? Let me start with a couple of non-climate risk examples. A new power plant might have to overcome a 1 in a million risk standard. In other words, modeling should estimate less than one additional case of cancer for every million people assumed to be exposed to the power plant's emissions 24 hours a day for 70 years. What about a more personal risk, like having your house burned down? There's substantially less than a 1 in 1,000 chance of that happening to you this year. So is that an acceptable risk? Apparently not, since we all buy fire insurance. What about getting on an airplane? There is less than a 1 in 10 million chance of dying in a commercial plane crash in the US in a given year. Most people seem willing to live with that level of risk, with relatively few people buying flight insurance. The bottom line is that humans tend to be pretty risk-averse about important things, both societally and individually. One risk probability scale goes like this. A high-risk probability is defined as more than 1 in 100. A low-risk probability is defined as between 1 in 1,000 and 1 in 10,000. A minimal risk probability is defined as between 1 in 100,000 and 1 in a million. So now let's turn to global warming. When we hear that the probability of something really bad happening is extremely unlikely or exceptionally unlikely, you'd probably assume we're talking about a minimal risk using the scale I just mentioned. But it turns out that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, which is the global body charged with assessing climate change risk, uses a very different risk scale. When the IPCC talks about an extremely unlikely outcome, for example, it doesn't mean less than 1 in 100,000. It means less than 5 times out of 100. When the IPCC talks about exceptionally unlikely, it doesn't mean less than 1 in a million. It means less than 1 in 100. In other words, exceptionally unlikely climate outcomes are a lot more likely than you might think based on the language we're used to. That's a real problem for the effectiveness of climate risk communication. What about the other side of the ledger? The IPCC says it's likely we can avoid 2 degrees centigrade of warming if we rapidly decarbonize our global economy. But likely in this case means 2 times out of 3. In other words, there's a 1 out of 3 chance of dangerous global warming even if we rapidly decarbonize. That's terrible odds given the risks involved. How is it the one risk scale defines minimal risk probability as between 1 in 100,000 and 1 in a million, while for climate change, exceptionally unlikely is defined as anything less than 1 chance in 100? Climate expert Oliver Gedden has an interesting answer to the question. He notes that global policymakers, who have called for limiting global warming to substantially less than 2 degrees centigrade, don't want to be seen as pursuing goals that scientists have declared to be unachievable. They would much rather be able to use a 5 minutes to midnight framing, in which no matter how bad the situation is, the goal they've set can still be characterized as achievable. The fact that the IPCC reports to global policymakers may explain why the IPCC characterizes risk probabilities the way it does. But the net effect, whether we're talking about 10 feet of sea level rise as being exceptionally unlikely, or our ability to still achieve the global target of 2 degrees as being likely, is that climate risks are being communicated in a sugar-coated way, probably leaving most of the public with little understanding of how serious the risks of global warming really are. This is Mark Trexler with the Costa Report's Climate Countdown. Thanks for listening.